Hi, I'm Patricia Allingham Carlson, and this is my video of how I painted my pink rose. This June's garden exploded with roses. They were so beautiful. I only have about 4 bushes. We planted 3 new ones last fall, and I'm still waiting to see them come into bloom. But when I get beautiful blooms on my bushes, I want to get my little Nikon Coolpix camera out and take as many pictures as I can. I'll use them for reference photos in the future. So let's go paint. I have my iPad next to my paper, and I am making a sketch from one of my photographs I took. These roses have so many little folds and so many little petals. It takes me a while to get a sketch that I like. And I won't take up all your time with this, but this is just what I'm doing, looking at my image and making the picture. Once I have a sketch that I like, I am squirting it down with my water sprayer, and then I'm waiting about 5 minutes. This allows the water to set just a little bit and not be quite as loose. Now what I'm trying to get here is the darker petals inside and the lighter edges as they unfold. So I'm coming in with concentrated paint on the inside edge of the petals. And I'm letting it run outward and not touching it a whole lot on the outside edges of the petals. This allows me to make a very nice loose sketch with watercolor to start, and yet keep some lighter spots on the rose where the petals are so pale from the light. Now, if you love watercolor like I do, one of the things you love is how it blooms and flows and does all these cool little unexpected things. And you could see that going on with my preliminary painting here. If you get a little explosion of color that you really like, leave it. See what you can do with it later in the picture. And if you don't like it later, you can always sort of paint it out, blend it out with a damp brush. So this might look like a big blur of colors with no structure or idea or form, but I am following my sketch, keeping the outer edges of each petal lighter and the inner edges more concentrated with darker watercolor for the shadows and the richness of the color. One of the primary colors I'm using right here is permanent rose. I'm also bringing in some alizarin crimson for the darker values and a little bit of quin magenta. The yellow colors that I've brought in are quin gold and cadmium yellow. With my initial colors laid down, I'm now going in and removing a little color and controlling it in some areas with a damp brush and then some paper towels. So I'm lifting a little color where it crept into places I wasn't exactly happy with it creeping into. A damp brush will take off a lot of color in a soft way at this stage. You can see I've also painted in some folds into the petals while it's damp, and that will create a very soft fold. Coming back to the work as it is now dried from the previous session, I am beginning to glaze in layers of color where I want things brighter, more vivid, or darker. And this is where I will paint in the structure of the flower. As well as lift out some petal edges that got lost in my very loose initial sketch. Some stiff brush work with a damp brush and then blotting with the paper towel. And that's what you see me doing here. When you're painting a rose or any flower, look at your image of your subject and see how the petals curl, catch light, or go into shadow, because that's what you're trying to paint, is what each petal is actually doing. I put in a much darker edge in the interior section of the petal, and then I soften it as it moves outward with water on my damp brush. And I'm moving from petal to petal to petal. Something else that I do is I work on the underlying petals first, and then I work on the overlapping petals. Putting the things on top after you've already painted the bottoms allows for a nicer edge and also allows for the feeling of perspective and dimension. At least that's how I work. And pop, do you see when I paint a darker color next to a lighter edge, how suddenly that edge pops out? And that's negative painting at a very, very pure form. The dark makes the light appear to be a positive shape. So you can see the petals starting to form as I work with the darks and the lights and the edges and the folds. It's a challenge and it's fun. I'm working now in an area that I messed up on. I had painted the whole little section solid, and upon looking at my reference photo, I saw that there was another petal in there. So I just lifted those two edges out to indicate the presence of another petal before moving on to the next section. People have said to me, don't you get lost with all these folds and petals and all this complicated form? And the answer actually is yes, I do. When I get badly lost and I realize I've totally changed a section of the flower around, what I generally do is try to reinvent how the flower could logically have that petal or those parts of petals and just make it up and wing it. If your conclusion is logical, you're generally going to be fine. So don't tell anybody that secret, but I certainly do mess up too. So I continue to glaze in more layers of color, and I'm working mostly with the interior section of the petal and the rose because that is what everything else is overlapping. Once I'm fairly satisfied with that, then I can build outward to the petals that overlap. The easiest petals are the outward petals on the very edge of the page because they go off the page and I don't have to worry about them as much. I've just about got the center of the rose to my satisfaction, and I'm moving outward now. This petal on the very edge is curling inward over the rose. And how I'm trying to show that is with lines that go along the edge of the rose and curl in the right direction inward. And the only way I can know what direction they should be curling on is by looking at the lines in the picture, because roses often have little veins that run through the petals. If you follow those lines, they are excellent references for the directionality of your petals. Again, darker as I move inward on the petal and lighter as I go outward, with some folds along the edges that curl to show the direction of the curl. And I'm glazing the petals with layers of paint. Starting light for the basic forms and then building up the color as I work further. I was trying to force myself to keep some good fresh whites in this picture and not paint any color at all. Because roses in the sun, at least in the photos I took and the way they look to my eyes, have a lot of light sparkling on them. They almost have a glow that way. So I'm trying to include this white. I think the hardest petals for me to paint are the ones that curl outward directly toward the viewer. But just looking at it and painting and drawing what you see is the best approach you can take. Now here I'm bringing in some purples. Quin purple or quin violet, as well as a little bit of purple lake to get a good strong dark where my image shows the darkest colors. This can add some nice accent contrast to my painting. As I form the petals more and more, moving outward to the edge, I'm trying to fade the color out. As the as the petals of the rose spread out, they become less concentrated in color because they're bigger and catching a lot more light than the interior, which is folded into itself and has a lot more shadowing and concentrated light. And looking at these light petals as I move to the outward edges, I'm starting to think about, well, what colors do I want to have around the flower? Because I have some background space showing. You can use any colors you want in your picture. You don't have to use what's in the image that you're looking at. Now, my image had pretty much light greens around it. So that's probably where I'll end up starting. And if it's light enough, I can change it to any other color. At this point in the painting, I'm going back and adding a final layer of glazing to enhance the colors. In some places, I'm adding some more gold or yellow. In other places, I'm adding a little more purple and lavender. And in yet others, I'm adding another layer of permanent rose to make the color as bright and rich as I feel it needs to be. And once the color's glazed on to the point where I'm satisfied, I then go around my edges and begin to soften them with a damp brush. And that's what you see me doing now. Hard edges are fine in some spots. I like some very soft edges too. When you soften them to the point where you almost can't see the edge, that's called a lost edge. After I've done my softening, I then try out some different colors to decide on a background color. I'm spraying down the background, which is just a little section, and holding my hand over the subject so I can get some nice watery wet on wet without leaking into my painting and wrecking my flower. At this point, I don't want to do that because I've worked for so hard on it. I thought this green color might be nice. This is Viridian, and I've also added a little bit of sap green. I wanted that minty color with just a little bit of yellowish green. I'm painting it in wet on wet and slowly getting it darker where I think it's needed. There's an example of a lost edge is out there on the left-hand top side where the rose fades almost into nothingness. And I try to make it fade into the background there too. Do you use lost edges on your painting? Or do you like all hard edges? I find I do a mixture. As I'm going back and tweaking my edges of my petals, I'm thinking that I'm just about done with this painting. And I was feeling pretty good about it. When I was done this day's painting session, I showed it to my art class, which is a bunch of very talented adult artists who are working to improve their skills. I asked them what they thought of it, and unfortunately, they didn't think that the background suited. They had a suggestion for me about deepening the colors of the background to make the rose pop a little more. So you'll see that coming up because I took their advice. So after they gave me their advice about darkening the background, I went outside and picked some leaves. I wanted to have some good dark colors to make it pop as per their suggestion. I wanted them to look natural. So I picked some leaves from the garden out back, and I mixed up a really strong dark. I put it down in a couple places and then softened it with water and brought it out toward the edge. Now, as said before, I could always add more, but this was a start. What do you think? Does that enhance the flower more to have those strong darks there? I had to agree with my friends, and they said it needed darkening, and that's what I did. I thought maybe a little bit of Antwerp blue would look nice too, and some gold. So I brought them in. And you can see me slowly adding more darkness and building it up. And then it was done. I hope you enjoyed my video, how I painted my watercolor pink rose. It really helps me out if you give me a thumbs up. If you ring the bell and subscribe, that helps me out too. I'd be interested to hear your comments, so please write them in the area below where you can. And there's some links for you to check out too, if you click on them below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.